Light a deep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. Some moments in life feel like miracles, not because they are grand, but because they touch the heart in the quietest, most unforgettable ways. That day, Tu Diep couldn't hold back her tears as she stood face to face with her long-lost brother, Officer Lee. Years of longing melted away in a single embrace, and beside them, James smiled gently, his presence turning the moment into something even more whole. At the dinner table, laughter echoed like music, chopsticks clinked, hearts opened, and for the first time in a long time, Tu Diep felt what it truly meant to be surrounded by love. A reunion, not just of people, but of souls once separated by fate, now brought together by something deeper: family, love, and healing. The golden afternoon sunlight spilled through the bamboo curtains, casting warm patterns on the old wooden floor. In the kitchen, the aroma of freshly steamed rice, simmering pork belly, and sweetened lotus soup wafted gently through the air, an aroma that once belonged to a childhood Tu Diep had thought long gone. She stood in front of the clay stove, her hands trembling as she stirred the pot, trying to focus, trying to hold herself together. The small house was quiet except for the soft bubbling of soup and the occasional chirp of birds outside. But in her heart, a storm was swirling of longing, of uncertainty, and above all, of hope. She hadn't seen her brother, Officer Lee, in 3 years, and James had disappeared into the chaos of lawsuits, betrayals, and sacrifices. She had believed, at one point, that love had lost its way in the whirlwind of ambition and pain. Tu Diep wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath, and walked out toward the front gate. Her footsteps slowed as she heard something, first the low hum of a motorbike, then the unmistakable sound of laughter. Not just any laughter, his laughter, their laughter. She stopped in her tracks, and there they were. Lee, in his crisp officer uniform, stepping off the bike with the same boyish grin he wore before leaving home, and James, elegant in his simplicity, holding a bag of longan fruits, her favorite. Their eyes found hers at the same time. Time seemed to still. Tu Diep clutched the doorframe. The corners of her lips quivered. "Shall hi," Lee called out, waving with the same enthusiasm he used when he was a boy chasing dragonflies. James stepped forward, his voice warm, filled with memories. "I promised I'd come back for dinner." That was all it took. Tears welled up into Diep's eyes. They streamed down her cheeks before she could even blink. Her knees buckled slightly, not from weakness but from the overwhelming flood of emotion she could no longer hold back. "I thought I'd lost you both," she whispered, her voice cracking. James reached out and gently took her hand, while Lee wrapped his arms around them both. Later, the small dining table, old but sturdy, was surrounded by warmth. The rice was served, the pork belly tender, and the laughter endless. The kind of laughter that only exists when hearts that have endured pain finally find peace. Lee spoke about his time on duty, sharing stories that made them all cry from laughter. James recalled how he nearly burned rice trying to cook while hiding from reporters. Tu Diep scolded them both for forgetting to wash their hands before eating, and they laughed harder than ever. The moon rose high above the village, casting silver light through the open window. But inside, beneath the flickering oil lamp, was a glow even stronger. A glow of reunion, of forgiveness, of love returning home. And Tu Diep, though her eyes were still red, smiled. The table had once felt too big. Now it was just right. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the laughter faded into quiet conversation, Tu Diep sat alone on the small porch, a cup of warm tea cradled in her hands. The moon hung low, like a gentle guardian watching over her home. Inside, Lee had dozed off on the floor mat like he used to as a boy, and James was helping her wash the last of the dishes. James stepped outside and stood beside her in silence. Tu Diep didn't speak at first. She sipped her tea, let the steam rise between them like a soft curtain. Then finally, she asked, her voice low, "Why did you come back now?" James exhaled. "Because I never stopped thinking about you. Even when the world was falling apart, it was always you I saw in the end." Tu Diep looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of working in the fields, selling vegetables at the market, caring for her little home. "You were gone a long time, I know." He sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I thought walking away would protect you from my mess, but all it did was create a bigger distance between us." There was a long pause. The cicadas sang in the background. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. James turned to her, eyes gentle. "I hated myself for not being there when you needed me most." Her eyes shimmered again, but this time, she didn't cry. She simply nodded and leaned her head against his shoulder. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was full of unspoken forgiveness, quiet healing. Inside, Lee stirred and called out sleepily, "Shilhai and James, don't stay up too late. Tomorrow we go pick bananas." James chuckled. "He hasn't changed a bit." Tu Diep laughed, the sound soft and sweet like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "No, he hasn't, but we have." They sat together for a while longer, watching the fireflies dance through the rice fields. It felt like the world had slowed down just for them to let love mend what time had tried to break. The next morning, sunlight poured into the house like honey. Tu Diep woke to the smell of Lee burning toast in the kitchen and James humming an old folk tune as he fed the chickens. She stepped outside, hair still messy, apron in hand. And when she saw them, her brother in his oversized sandals, and James chasing a stubborn hen, she laughed out loud, freely, for the first time in a long time. This was home again, not just a place, but a feeling, a promise, a new beginning. Later that week, the village was alive with color. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze. Paper flowers bloomed on the fences, and children ran barefoot across the dusty paths with sticky rice cakes in hand. It was the mid-autumn festival, a time for family, harvest, and renewal. Tu Diep stood at the front of her stall at the local fair, arranging bundles of fresh herbs and bamboo-wrapped desserts. Her fingers worked quickly, but her heart fluttered every time she caught a glimpse of James across the street, helping set up lanterns with the village kids. He was laughing, his sleeves rolled up, the same familiar dimple on his cheek catching the sunlight. "Are you going to keep staring, or are you going to offer him a mooncake?" Lee teased, walking by with 2 sugarcane drinks in his hands. Tu Diep blushed and swatted her brother playfully on the arm. "Mind your own business, Officer Lee." Lee grinned. "Hard not to when the air between you two is thicker than coconut pudding." As the sun began to set, the 3 of them walked back home together. James carried the basket of leftover goods while Lee told stories about his latest police training, most of which sounded too heroic to be true. That night, under a sky glittering with stars and lanterns floating like dreams overhead, James pulled Tu Diep aside. They stood by the old jackfruit tree behind her house, the same one they used to sit beneath when they were younger. "I saw something today," he said softly. "What?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny, hand-woven ring made of dried grass. "You made this years ago. I found it in the old box by the tree." Tu Diep stared at it, breath caught in her throat. "I'd forgotten. I didn't." He held it up to the moonlight. "You once said that if you gave this to someone, it meant you'd chosen them with your whole heart." She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "And you're giving it back?" "No," he replied, stepping closer. "I'm asking if that choice still stands." Her eyes welled up. "James, my life for it hasn't been easy. I'm not the same girl who made that ring. I know. And I don't want the girl you were," he said gently. "I want the woman you've become, strong, resilient, that kind. I want you." For a moment, the night held its breath. Then Tu Diep placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the ring. Her touch was warm, steady. "It still stands," she said. Behind them, Lee peeked from the window, holding back a cheer and shaking his head with a grin. Finally, he muttered, "About time." Life lesson: the beauty of reunions and the power of unspoken love. In life, we often chase after distant dreams, forgetting that the most precious moments are not always found in grand achievements or faraway places, but in the quiet laughter around a dinner table, the gentle warmth of shared memories, and the people who silently walk beside us through every season of change. Tu Diep's story reminds us of a lesson that is both simple and profound. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from fixing everything that went wrong, but from recognizing what still remains right. After years of separation, hardship, and personal struggle, Tu Diep found herself surrounded once again by the two most important men in her life: her protective brother, Officer Lee, and James, the man who had once silently walked away so she could grow strong on her own. Their reunion was not built on apologies or explanations. It was built on presence, on being there without conditions. In that quiet moment when Tu Diep burst into tears as she saw her brother and James laughing over the reunion meal, we saw what it means to be human. We cry not because we are broken, but because we finally feel safe to feel everything we held in for too long. There is power in reconciliation, not just with others, but with ourselves. Tu Diep had learned to work the soil, to sell at the market, to laugh with neighbors and stand on her own feet. But it was through reuniting with her past, with the people who truly knew her, that she learned she didn't have to carry strength alone. Love does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it sits beside you, helps hang lanterns with children, or finds an old ring made of dried grass. It waits patiently, hoping you will one day remember what your heart once believed and still believes. So what can we learn? Value the people who stay. They may not always have the right words, but their presence is more powerful than any apology. Let your heart soften. Cry if you must. Tears are not a sign of weakness, but of healing. Believe in second chances. Life rarely goes according to plan, but it often leads us back to what truly matters. And most of all, remember, you don't need a perfect ending to have a beautiful story. Sometimes, a simple dinner, a shared laugh, and a quiet reunion are enough to remind you that you are loved. In a world that moves so quickly, we often forget to pause and look back, not to dwell on pain, but to honor the journey that brought us here. Tu Diep's reunion was more than just a meal shared between loved ones. It was a quiet celebration of resilience, forgiveness, and unspoken love. Her tears were not just for the past, they were also for the future, a future where she no longer had to face the world alone. Surrounded by her brother's protection and James's steady love, she realized that home is not a place. It is people. It is the laughter echoing in a small kitchen. It is the scent of rice steaming on a humble stove. It is the soft grip of a hand that once let go, but now refuses to leave. This story teaches us that life is a series of seasons. There are seasons of loss and loneliness, but also seasons of return. When we let go of pride and open our hearts to those we once pushed away, or who walked away for the right reasons, we often find that love never truly left. It just waited patiently for the right moment to come back. So let us not fear the cracks in our lives, as Tu Diep learned. It is through those cracks that light enters, and sometimes all it takes is one shared meal, one unexpected reunion, to remind us that we are still worthy of love, of family, and of new beginnings. Cherish the reunions, however small, celebrate the people who show up, and never underestimate the quiet power of being together again. After all,